I built my parents' business for 8 years. At my brother's wedding, Dad signed it over to him. I didn't argue. I just left. My brother ran it into the ground within a year. Dad left me a voicemail. For minutes of crying. I haven't called back. Before I tell you about the dramatic outcome of the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and listen to the whole story. The clinking of crystal glass echoed through the grand, vaulted ceilings of the Sedona ballroom. It was a sound I usually associated with celebration, a sound that meant a job was finished and a client was happy. But that night, it became the soundtrack to the greatest betrayal of my entire life. My younger brother Elijah's wedding was a lavish, over-the-top affair that screamed of new money and misplaced priorities. Massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow over tables draped in imported silk. The floral arrangements alone probably cost more than my first truck. There was an open bar serving top-shelf liquor to over 200 guests, a live 10-piece band, and a pervasive atmosphere of manufactured perfection. I sat at the head table, wearing a stiff, tailored suit that felt like a straitjacket. I was 34 years old, and my hands, resting on the crisp white tablecloth, were rough, calloused, and permanently stained with the faint, stubborn hue of walnut stain. I felt completely out of place among Olivia's wealthy family and Elijah's fraternity brothers, but I was genuinely trying to be happy for him. He was my brother, after all. My dad, Matthew, stood up at the microphone. He tapped his champagne flute with a silver spoon. The room quieted down, the low hum of conversation fading into an expectant silence. My dad always hated public speaking. He was a man of the woodshop, a guy who let his calloused hands and his table saws do the talking. He usually stumbled over his words at family dinners, let alone in front of a crowd of hundreds. So, when he confidently pulled a thick, custom-made leather-bound folder from inside his tuxedo jacket, my brow furrowed in confusion. I assumed he had painstakingly written down a heartfelt speech and wanted to read it perfectly. I was so incredibly wrong. He looked out at the sea of faces, his chest puffed out with pride. Then, he looked directly at Elijah, completely ignoring my existence, sitting just 3 feet away at the very same table. He started talking about legacy. His voice boomed through the speakers. He talked about family bloodlines, about the future, and about how a man needs a rock-solid foundation to build his life and his marriage upon. He spoke about the American dream, about building something from the dirt up. I nodded along, a small, proud smile touching my lips. I thought he was talking about our shared hard work. I thought he was acknowledging the blood, sweat, and tears we had poured into the family name. Then he opened the leather folder. Elijah, my father said, his voice thick with emotion. A man needs a kingdom to rule. He needs a legacy to pass down to his own children. Your mother and I have talked, and we believe it is time to secure your future. Therefore, as our wedding gift to you and Olivia, I am officially signing over 100% sole ownership of Callahan & Sons custom cabinetry and millwork. It is yours, my boy, the entire business. Let it well. The air violently left my lungs. It felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my ribs. The entire room erupted in deafening applause. People were cheering, standing up, raising their expensive champagne glasses, weeping at the incredibly beautiful, generous gesture of a father passing the torch to his son. I sat there utterly paralyzed. My brain simply refused to process the words. I looked at the folder in my dad's hands, the legal documents catching the light of the chandeliers. I looked at my brother, who was grinning ear to ear, pumping his fist in the air, already acting like a conquering corporate hero who had just closed the deal of the century. Olivia was practically vibrating with greed, her eyes locked on the paperwork. And then I looked at my dad. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He purposely kept his gaze fixed on Elijah, his smile wide and unnatural. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was handing over a massive inheritance, a thriving $1 million business that I had built with my own hands for 8 solid years. He was giving away my late nights, my early mornings, my ruined back, and my sacrificed 20s to a man who didn't even know how to properly calibrate a table saw. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table, smash my glass, or scream about the sheer, suffocating injustice of it all. I didn't give Olivia's snobby family the satisfaction of a public meltdown. My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ground together, sending a sharp ache up into my temples. I quietly took my linen napkin, folded it meticulously into a perfect square, and set it down next to my untouched plate. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor, and stood up. My girlfriend, Chloe, sitting next to me, grabbed my wrist. Her eyes were wide with sheer panic and profound sorrow. She knew. She had seen me come home covered in sawdust, exhausted to the bone. For years, I didn't say a word to her. I just gave her a slight, nearly imperceptible nod. We walked out of that ballroom together. I kept my back straight and my eyes fixed on the heavy oak exit doors. We left behind the cheers, the clinking glasses, the overwhelming stench of expensive perfume, and the family that had just sold my entire life down the river without a second thought. But to understand why my dad's pathetic, 4-minute crying voicemail a year later was so utterly ridiculous, you need to know exactly how much blood I poured into that name, and how deep the rot in my family truly went. Growing up in our small, dusty town in Arizona, the lines within our family were drawn early and drawn deep. I was the quiet one, the kid who was content to sit in the garage for hours with a block of scrap pine and a carving knife. I liked the smell of fresh-cut oak, the precise mathematics of joinery, and the satisfying hum of machinery. Elijah, on the other hand, was the golden child. He had the charm, the easy, dazzling smile, and a natural, infuriating ability to make people believe he was destined for absolute greatness without ever actually lifting a finger to prove it. When it was time for college, my parents sat us down at the kitchen table. They had a modest college fund saved up. I told them I wanted to go to a local community college to take some business classes, then jump straight into the trades. Elijah wanted to go to a massive, out-of-state university known more for its football team and Greek life than its academics. My parents drained every single penny of that college fund to send Elijah away. They bought him a car, paid his rent, and funded a lifestyle of tailgate parties and endless socializing. He spent 4 years skipping classes, drinking heavily, and barely scraping by with a generic communications degree that he never once put to use. He bounced from job to job with dizzying speed. He tried selling life insurance but hated cold calling. He tried residential real estate but complained about working on weekends. He even worked at a luxury car dealership for a few months before deciding the management didn't recognize his true potential. Every time he quit or got fired, my mother was there with a warm meal and a ready-made excuse about how the world just didn't understand his brilliance. I took a radically different path. I dropped out of my community college business program after one grueling semester. I didn't need a professor to read from a textbook to know what I wanted to do with my life. I walked into my dad's small, perpetually struggling custom cabinetry shop when I was barely 19 years old. I put on a pair of scratched safety glasses, strapped on a leather tool belt, and never looked back. Callahan & Sons was barely keeping its head above water back then. My dad was a decent carpenter, but a terrible businessman. He undercharged, he overpromised, and he had no concept of modern workflow. I started at the absolute bottom. I swept mountains of sawdust, hauled heavy sheets of MDF, and cleaned the spray booth until my lungs ached. I learned every single machine, every dangerous technique, and every irritating quirk of the local lumber suppliers. While Elijah was out partying on our parents' dime, nursing hangovers on Tuesday mornings, I was clocking in at 5 a.m. in the freezing cold. I would come home covered in a thick, inescapable layer of fine dust, smelling intensely of chemical lacquer, sweat, and hard work. My mother would look at me across the dinner table with a sigh of mild disappointment, asking when I was going to wash my hands properly and get a real, respectable job in an office. Simultaneously, she would praise Elijah to the heavens for simply managing to wake up before noon. Elijah would show up for Thanksgiving dinner wearing a crisp, expensive shirt, talk a massive game about his latest grand, world-changing business idea, and my parents would hang on to his every single word like he was a visiting prophet. I sat there quietly, eating my dry turkey, knowing I had a massive custom kitchen installation the next morning that was paying the mortgage on the house we were sitting in. I never resented the actual work. I loved the shop. I loved the tangible reality of taking a raw, ugly stack of lumber and wrestling it into something beautiful, functional, and permanent. But the staggering disparity in how we were treated was a bitter, jagged pill I was forced to swallow daily. I stupidly thought that if I just worked harder, if I proved my worth through undeniable financial results, my parents would finally see me. I didn't realize that in their eyes, the sweaty worker in the background would never, ever shine as bright as the golden child standing in the spotlight. By the time I turned 26, I wasn't just working in the shop. I was running the entire operation. My dad was getting older. His joints were aching with arthritis, his vision was slipping, and he was perfectly content to let the business coast along, pulling in maybe $300,000 a year in gross revenue. It was enough to pay the bills, but it was stagnant. I saw the massive potential slipping through our fingers. I saw the local housing market booming, wealthy retirees moving into the county, and I knew we could do so much more than just build simple, boring box cabinets for tract homes. I spent 3 weeks staying up past midnight, putting together a comprehensive, 50-page business plan to expand Callahan & Sons into full-scale, luxury kitchen and bathroom remodeling. I mapped out supply chains, marketing strategies, and profit margins. It took months of exhausting arguments to convince my dad to take the risk. He was terrified of change. He fought me at every turn. But I pushed, I argued, and eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, he gave me the green light. Fine, Mason. Do it your way. But if it tanks, it's on your head, he had warned me. I took a meager salary during those expansion years, choosing to reinvest every single spare dollar back into better, faster equipment and aggressive local marketing. I worked 60, sometimes 80-hour weeks. I was the first one to unlock the doors in the pitch black of morning and the last one to set the alarm at night. Sometimes, I just slept on a cot in the cramped office because driving home felt like a waste of time. I hunted down lucrative new clients, formed tight relationships with top-tier interior designers who catered to the wealthy, and personally project-managed every single build. The results spoke for themselves. Within 3 grueling years, I had completely revolutionized the business. I tripled our revenue. We went from scraping by to pulling in close to $1 million annually. We were no longer a small-town mom-and-pop shop struggling to make payroll. We were the most highly respected custom woodworking business in a 50-mile radius. The physical workload became far too much for just me and my dad, so I started hiring. That's when I brought on David and Joseph. They were 2 incredibly talented, hungry craftsmen who shared my fanatical, obsessive attention to detail. I trained them myself. I taught them my exact standards, my proprietary finishing processes, and my relentless work ethic. We operated like a well-oiled, unstoppable machine. My dad would occasionally walk through the bustling shop floor, holding a cup of coffee he hadn't brewed, pat me on the back, and say things like, "You're doing good work, son. One day, this will all be yours and your brother's." He talked about it like a royal inheritance, a sacred legacy he was building for us, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one actually laying the bricks. I foolishly believed him. I thought I was securing my long-term future. I thought every drop of sweat, every splinter, every missed weekend was a direct investment in a company that would bear my name for decades to come. I never once asked for a formal promotion. I never demanded a massive salary bump. I didn't need a fancy office chair or my name painted on the glass door. I had the deep respect of my crew, the fierce loyalty of our high-end clients, and the undeniable concrete proof that I had built an empire from the dirt up. I thought that was enough. The entire dynamic of our family and the business violently shifted the moment Elijah met Olivia. Olivia came from a notoriously wealthy, old-money family in the next town over. She had expensive, insatiable tastes and possessed a ruthless, calculating streak when it came to social climbing. She looked at Elijah not for who he was, a lazy, unmotivated talker, but for the potential of what he could provide to maintain her lifestyle. And since Elijah's sporadic, embarrassing career history provided nothing but empty promises and bounced checks. He suddenly, desperately needed a stable, highly lucrative anchor to impress her family. That anchor, of course, was the thriving, cash-flush business I had built. About a year before the lavish wedding, Elijah suddenly started showing up at the shop. He didn't come in steel-toed work boots or dusty jeans. He strolled onto the active production floor wearing expensive, tailored slacks, perfectly ironed button-down shirts, and Italian leather loafers, looking like a corporate auditor visiting a gritty factory. He would walk around the floor with his hands clasped behind his back, pointing at expensive machinery he couldn't turn on, asking incredibly superficial questions, and acting like he was conducting a high-level efficiency review. At first, I thought it was a hilarious joke. I told David and Joseph to ignore him, figuring he would get bored after a week, complain about the sawdust ruining his shoes, and move on to his next shiny distraction. But he kept coming. He started inviting himself into my client meetings. I would be going over complex architectural blueprints with a demanding designer, and Elijah would sit there, nodding thoughtfully, throwing in meaningless corporate buzzwords like synergy and vertical integration, while I did the actual exhausting work of estimating load-bearing capacities and material costs. The worst part wasn't Elijah's sudden, parasitic interest. It was my dad's baffling, sickening reaction to it. Matthew absolutely ate it up. He was visibly thrilled that his golden boy was finally showing an interest in the dirty family trade. He started introducing Elijah to our biggest, most important clients not as an observer, but as the brilliant future of the company. He would take Elijah out for long, expensive, 2-hour lunches at the country club to discuss big-picture business strategy, putting the meals on the company card. Meanwhile, I stayed back at the noisy shop, eating a cold, squished sandwich over a set of dusty blueprints, trying to figure out how to meet a looming deadline. I brought it up to my dad one evening when everyone else had gone home. I cornered him in the office. I asked him point-blank why Elijah was suddenly involved in high-level client relations when he literally didn't know the difference between white oak and yellow pine. My dad just waved his hand, brushing me off like an annoying fly. "Relax, Mason. He's got a brilliant mind for business. You handle the production side, you're good with your hands. Let your brother handle the networking and the vision. It's a team effort." There was no promotion for me. There was no equity contract drafted. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that I was the sole reason there was any networking to be done in the first place. I was just the dumb workhorse pulling the heavy cart, while Elijah sat comfortably in the driver's seat, wearing a tailored suit, completely and utterly ignorant of the dangerous road ahead. The real, fatal knife in the back didn't actually happen at the wedding reception. It happened a few days prior, though my brain refused to process the gravity of it until much later. I had stopped by my parents' house on a rainy Tuesday evening to drop off some urgent tax paperwork for my dad to sign. The front door was unlocked, as usual, so I just walked in, wiping my boots on the mat. I heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was my mom and dad. I stopped dead in the hallway when I heard my own name. "Are you absolutely sure Mason won't cause a massive scene at the reception?" my mom asked. Her voice was hushed, frantic, and laced with nervous guilt. "He won't," my dad replied, his tone dismissive and frighteningly confident. "He's steady. He's always been steady as a rock. He'll understand that Elijah needs this far more than he does. Mason can survive anywhere, he's a survivor. Elijah needs a lifeline, Margaret, especially with a girl like Olivia. If he doesn't have a solid title and a serious income, her family will eat him alive." I know, my mom sighed heavily. "I just want the wedding to be perfectly flawless. I even went to the boutique with Olivia yesterday to pick out that custom leather binder for the presentation documents. She's so incredibly excited. She thinks it's going to make Elijah look like a CEO." I stood there in the dark, narrow hallway, my heart pounding so violently in my chest it deafened me. The leather binder, the presentation documents. They were planning something massive. My own mother, the woman who had watched me come home physically broken, exhausted, and battered for 8 years to build their bank accounts, was actively, eagerly conspiring to hand my life's work over to my brother, simply to appease his materialistic, snobby fiancé. She knew. She had helped plan the ambush. She literally chose the wrapping paper for the knife they were going to stick directly into my spine. I slowly, quietly backed out of the house. I gently closed the front door without making a sound. I got into my truck, drove 2 blocks away, parked, and sat there for an hour, staring blankly through the windshield at the pouring rain. I desperately told myself I was misinterpreting the conversation. I told myself my parents, despite their blatant favoritism, wouldn't do something so unfathomably cold, so meticulously calculated. I convinced my desperate mind that it was just some minor administrative change, maybe giving Elijah a fake vice president title to make him look impressive for his new in-laws. I was a colossal fool. They had orchestrated the entire handover, working with lawyers behind my back, perfectly timing the announcement for maximum public impact in front of 200 people, so I wouldn't dare object and ruin the perfect day. They weaponized my loyalty, my quiet nature, and my refusal to cause public drama against me. The morning after the wedding, I woke up at exactly 4 a.m. It was pure muscle memory. My body was hardwired to get up before the sun, drink a pot of black coffee, and head to the shop. Chloe rolled over in our bed, looked at my silhouette in the dim light, and asked softly, her voice thick with sleep and worry, "Mason, what are you doing?" I didn't have a grand, sweeping plan. I just had an overwhelming, primal need to sever the cord before the poison reached my heart. I drove to Callahan and Sons. The massive parking lot was entirely empty. The giant, illuminated wooden sign above the main door, the sign I had personally designed and paid to have refurbished just 2 years ago, mocked me in the pre-dawn darkness. I unlocked the heavy steel front door and walked onto the massive shop floor. I didn't touch a single piece of inventory that belonged to the company. I didn't take a single brass screw, a square of sandpaper, or a scrap of cheap plywood. But over the last 8 years, because my dad was incredibly cheap and refused to upgrade our equipment, I had slowly amassed about $15,000 worth of my own personal high-end tools. Specialty plunge routers, German-engineered measuring instruments, Japanese pull saws, and custom chisels. I pulled my truck up to the back loading dock and spent 2 hours methodically, silently packing my gear into heavy hard cases. The silence in the cavernous shop was absolutely deafening. Every deep scratch on the solid oak workbenches, every chemical stain on the gray concrete floor was a direct testament to my backbreaking labor. At exactly 6:30 a.m., my cell phone started buzzing in my pocket. It was Elijah. I stared at the screen for a second, then let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, my mom called. Voicemail. Then my dad. Voicemail. They were waking up in their expensive hotel suites, probably nursing massive hangovers from the open bar, fully expecting me to show up, turn on the lights, and open the shop for my brother like a good, dutiful little employee. I finished loading the last heavy case of routers into my truck bed. I walked over to the main drafting workbench, the exact spot where I had designed our most complex, profitable projects. I took my heavy, worn brass shop key off my keyring. The metal was smooth from years of use. I set it down gently on the scarred wood. I grabbed a thick black Sharpie marker and wrote 2 words in giant letters on a piece of scrap maple: "Good luck." I left the piece of wood sitting right next to the key, walked out the back door, and locked the deadbolt behind me for the final time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like a brave rebel. I felt completely, utterly hollowed out, leaving the magnificent ruins of my own making to a man who literally didn't know how to hold a hammer without injuring himself. The crushing reality of my impulsive decision hit me a few days later when I sat down at our kitchen table and checked my personal bank account. I had walked away from a very steady, substantial paycheck, and because I had reinvested so much of my own money back into the company's equipment, my personal savings were dangerously, terrifyingly low. Chloe and I were forced to break the lease on our nice, comfortable downtown apartment. We scrambled and moved into a cramped, run-down, 2-bedroom rental on the far industrial side of town. The heating barely functioned, the exposed pipes rattled violently every time you turned on the faucet, and the terrifying reality of starting from absolute, terrifying zero weighed on me like a physical, crushing burden. I was 34 years old, technically unemployed, and entirely cut off from the only career, the only identity I had ever known. Desperation began to creep in around the edges of my mind. I desperately needed to know where I stood legally before I made my next move. I pulled together enough cash to consult with Luke, a razor-sharp, no-nonsense corporate lawyer who had helped me draft some complex vendor contracts a few years back. We sat in his sleek, glass-walled office, and I laid out the entire pathetic, humiliating story. I told him about the wedding toast, the secret transfer of ownership, the parents' betrayal, and my sudden, silent departure. Luke listened quietly, taking meticulous notes on a legal pad, his expression unreadable. When I finally finished venting, he set his pen down, leaned back in his expensive leather chair, and looked at me intensely. "Mason, let me ask you a very simple question," he said, his voice calm. "Did you ever, at any point in the last 8 years, sign a formal employment contract with Callahan and Sons?" "No," I replied, shaking my head. "It was a family business. My dad hated paperwork. We did absolutely everything on a handshake and blind trust." Luke raised an eyebrow. "Did you ever sign a non-compete agreement? Anything restricting your ability to work in this county?" "Never. Not a single piece of paper." A slow, almost predatory smile spread across Luke's face. He tossed his pen onto the desk. "Mason, you are a completely free man. They own the cinderblock building, the rusty machinery you left behind, and the name on the door. But you own the actual skill. You own the vendor relationships. You own the proprietary knowledge. You can walk out of this office today, rent a garage right across the street from them, and start poaching every single client you ever brought in, and there is absolutely nothing they can do to stop you legally. They have no case." It was the very first piece of genuinely good news I had received in weeks. A massive weight lifted off my chest. But knowing I had the legal right to start over didn't magically put expensive tools back in my hands, nor did it put high-paying clients on my empty books. I went back to our freezing, ugly apartment, sat on a cheap plastic folding chair in the living room, and put my heavy head in my hands. The mountain ahead of me looked impossible to climb. Chloe walked over, knelt down in front of me, wrapped her warm arms around my shoulders, and kissed the top of my head. "You built an empire once from nothing but sawdust," she said softly, looking fiercely into my eyes. "You know exactly how the machine works. Now you just have to go build it for yourself. No partners, no leeches, just you." Her unwavering faith in me was the spark of ignition I desperately needed. I wasn't dead yet. I was just starting over, and this time I was keeping all the equity. Armed with a violent, renewed sense of purpose, I started hustling like a man possessed. I rented a small, drafty, corrugated metal garage workspace on the industrial outskirts of town. It was pathetic compared to my massive old shop floor, but it was mine. My first major, critical hurdle was securing raw materials. High-end custom woodworking requires flawless, high-quality lumber, and that requires a massive line of credit. I put on a clean shirt and drove down to see Julian, the owner of the largest, most prestigious lumber yard in the county. Julian and I had done serious business together for over 6 years. I had personally pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars his way. We had drank beers together after hours. He knew my fiancé's name. I genuinely considered him a friend in a cutthroat industry. I walked into his cluttered office, smiling, ready to ask for a standard 30-day net credit line on a small order of white oak, just to get my first few independent jobs off the ground. Julian looked up from his computer screen, and the blood instantly drained from his face. His expression hardened into a defensive mask. He didn't offer to shake my hand. He didn't even offer me a seat. "Mason," he said, his voice flat and incredibly awkward. "What are you doing here?" I ignored the chill and gave him my confident pitch. I told him I was striking out on my own, starting fresh, and needed a small favor to get the ball rolling. Julian shook his head slowly, refusing to make eye contact. "I can't do it, Mason. Company policy." I stared at him, my smile dying instantly. "Policy? Julian, what are you talking about?" I've cleared over $1 million through this yard in the last few years. I pay my invoices early. You know my credit is immaculate. You know I'm good for it." Julian shifted violently in his chair, looking everywhere but at me. "Look, man, this is incredibly difficult. But Elijah came to see me yesterday afternoon. He came in hot. He signed an exclusive, massive 3-year supply contract with us for all of Callahan and Sons materials. It's the biggest contract we've landed this year. But," Julian swallowed hard, a flash of deep guilt in his eyes. "But it came with an ironclad stipulation. If I sell to you, Mason, if I sell you even a single warped board of scrap pine, he pulls the entire multi-million-dollar contract and sues me for breach. I'm sorry, Mason. My hands are tied. It's just business." My blood literally boiled in my veins. The betrayal was staggering. Elijah didn't just steal my company. He was actively, maliciously using its massive financial weight to starve me out in the cold. He was explicitly bribing my own suppliers to cut me off at the knees before I could even stand up and fight back. He wanted me ruined. I didn't yell at Julian. I didn't flip his desk. I just looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You backed the wrong horse, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Elijah doesn't know how to run that shop. And when he runs that company straight into the ground and defaults on your massive contract, do not bother calling my phone." I walked out of that lumber yard with empty hands, the cold reality of my brother's viciousness settling deep into my bones. The war wasn't just about hurt pride anymore. It was about sheer, brutal survival. Agonizing month passed. I managed to scrape together enough subpar materials from smaller, distant, out-of-town suppliers by paying pure cash, draining the last of my meager reserves. I was taking on tiny, humiliating jobs just to keep the lights on, fixing broken dining chairs, installing cheap prefab cabinets for landlords, anything that paid a few $100. One miserable, rainy afternoon, I walked into a local, Greasy Spoon diner to grab a cheap cup of black coffee to warm my hands. I immediately ran into Wyatt. Wyatt was an incredibly sharp, anxious guy who had been the lead accountant for Callahan and Sons for the last 5 years. He looked like death warmed over. He was nursing a black coffee, violently rubbing his temples, dark circles carving bags under his eyes. He saw me walk in and immediately flagged me down like a drowning man. "Mason, thank God. Sit down. You look incredibly tired, but you look a hell of a lot better than your brother does right now." I sat down in the cracked vinyl booth. Wyatt didn't need any prompting. The dam broke instantly. "It's a disaster over there, man. A complete, unmitigated, catastrophic disaster." Wyatt leaned across the table, checking over his shoulder, keeping his voice to a frantic whisper. "Elijah is burning through cash like he's shoveling it into a furnace. He hired a social media branding manager from Los Angeles for $5,000 a month. He completely rebranded the logo, bought brand new, expensive fleet wraps for all the work trucks. But to pay for it, he fired the entire quality control department." I shook my head in disbelief. "What about actual production? Are they building anything?" "It's absolute chaos," Wyatt groaned, burying his face in his hands. "He promises wealthy clients completely impossible, compressed timelines just to get the initial deposit. And then he screams at the crew when they physically can't deliver. The material waste is astronomical because they are rushing and making mistakes. I'm looking at the ledgers every day, Mason. He's operating at a massive, bleeding loss, and he's actively masking it from your dad by taking out high-interest, short-term predatory loans. The vendors are getting angry. He's missing net 30 payments. Julian is already threatening to hold shipments." I felt a strange, dizzying mixture of dark validation and deep, profound sorrow. I hated my brother with a burning passion for what he did to me, but hearing that the business I had meticulously, lovingly built was rotting from the inside out was incredibly painful. It felt like I was hearing about the terminal illness of a child I had raised. "How long do they have?" I asked grimly. Wyatt scoffed bitterly. "If he doesn't land a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial contract immediately and miraculously deliver it flawlessly, 6 months. Maybe less before the creditors seized the building. He's driving a speeding car toward a cliff, and he's too busy taking selfies for Instagram to look at the road. I paid for Wyatt's coffee, patted him on the shoulder, and left the diner. The golden child was cracking under the immense pressure of actual tangible work. The shiny facade was crumbling, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the heavy debris hit the ground. The massive turning point came on a dreary Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my cold garage, sanding a scrap piece of wood, when my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in nearly 8 months. Mr. Carter. Carter was one of the most prominent, ruthless, wealthy luxury home builders in the entire state. He was a hard-nosed, screamingly demanding client, but he paid massive invoices on time, in cash, and he commanded absolute respect in the industry. I had fought tooth and nail to win his business years ago. I answered on the second ring, clearing the dust from my throat. Mason speaking. Mason, this is Carter. I hear through the grapevine you're finally out on your own. His voice was gruff, furious, and vibrating with tension. That's right, sir. Operating independently now. Good. Because your idiot brother is a complete and utter fraud. Carter didn't mince words. He never did. I stupidly gave Callahan and Sons the massive contract for the master vanity installations on the Ridgeview Estate project. Elijah swore up and down, shook my hand, and promised the quality would remain identical to when you were running the floor. I just walked the site an hour ago. The joinery is sloppy, amateur garbage. The finishes are uneven, the stain is blotchy, and they missed the critical installation deadline by 2 full weeks. I threw his entire pathetic crew off my site and fired them. I felt a massive jolt of pure adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I'm incredibly sorry to hear that, Mr. Carter. That's unacceptable. Don't patronize me, Mason, he snapped. I need the master bathroom in the multimillion-dollar model home fixed immediately, stripped down to the studs and rebuilt from scratch. I need it absolutely perfect, and I need it done in exactly 4 days for a massive showing with international buyers. Can you do it? Or are you going to give me excuses too? I'll be on the site in 20 minutes, I said, already grabbing my keys. I threw my heavy tools into the back of my truck, broke several speed limits driving to the Ridgeview estate, and surveyed the wreckage. Carter was absolutely right. The work was insulting, amateurish garbage. It looked like it was built by a blindfolded high school shop class. I immediately took a sledgehammer and tore every single piece of it out, throwing Elijah's trash into the dumpster. For the next 3 days and nights, I barely slept. I existed on black coffee and sheer, unadulterated spite. I worked with a manic, obsessive intensity, pouring every single ounce of my pent-up frustration, anger, and unparalleled skill into that woodwork. I sourced the absolute finest, rarest walnut I could find from a private dealer. I hand-cut every single dovetail joint. I hand-rubbed the oil finish until the wood looked like polished glass. I didn't just meet his impossibly high standard. I shattered it. When Carter walked into the master bathroom on the morning of the 4th day, he stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly walked over, running his calloused hand along the flawless, seamless, glowing edge of the massive vanity. He stood in absolute silence for a long, agonizing minute. Then he looked at me, a rare smirk breaking across his hardened face. "I knew it," he muttered. "I knew you were the only brains and talent in that entire family." He pulled out his heavy leather checkbook, wrote me a massive check on the spot, and then intentionally added a 20% bonus to the total. He ripped it out and handed it to me. "You keep your damn phone on, Mason. I'm tearing up Elijah's master contract for the rest of the development. We're going to be doing a lot of business together." I looked at the number on the check. It was enough to secure a real shop. That check was my lifeline. It was the very first lethal strike back. I had just taken a massive, lucrative feast directly off Elijah's plate, and the taste of victory was absolutely incredible. Word travels incredibly fast in the tight-knit construction trades. Mr. Carter didn't keep his mouth shut about the unmitigated disaster at Ridgeview, nor did he hide the fact that he had fired the new Callahan and Sons and that I had swooped in and saved the entire multimillion-dollar project. The momentum began to violently shift in my direction. I secured 2 more highly lucrative, small custom jobs that very same week, bringing in enough cash flow to finally upgrade some of my cheaper, failing tools, pay off my outstanding debts, and breathe a little easier for the first time in months. But the real, defining victory arrived the following Monday morning. I was in my drafty, freezing garage, carefully running a piece of expensive cherry trim through the router, when a familiar, beat-up, rusted pickup truck pulled into the cracked concrete driveway. The heavy doors creaked open, and David and Joseph stepped out into the cold air. These were the 2 master craftsmen I had personally hired, trained, and mentored years ago at Callahan. They were the best in the business. They walked into my garage, looking around at the cramped space, the cheap fluorescent lighting, and the absolute lack of basic amenities. "Boys," I said, wiping a thick layer of sawdust off my hands, my heart skipping a beat. "What brings you out here to the slums?" David, a massive bear of a man with a thick beard and a man of very few words, crossed his muscular arms over his chest. "We quit." Joseph, younger and far more animated, nodded vigorously, his face red with lingering anger. "Elijah is a total nightmare, boss. He is an absolute clown. He doesn't know a dovetail joint from a hole in the ground. He screamed in my face yesterday in front of the whole crew because I flat out refused to use cheap, water-damaged particle board on a luxury, $50,000 custom cabinet build. He told me to just glue it together and paint over the horrific defects so the client wouldn't notice. I told him where he could shove his paint. I threw my heavy framing hammer on his glass desk, shattered the corner of it, and walked right out the front door. Dave packed his bags and followed me 10 minutes later. I looked at them, overwhelmed with a sense of loyalty I hadn't felt in a year. "You guys know I'm operating out of a freezing garage, right? I can't pay you anywhere near the salary or the benefits you were making over there. Not yet. I don't have health care. I don't have a break room. We don't care," David said flatly, his voice rumbling like a diesel engine. "We want to build good things, Mason. We want to work for a guy who actually respects the wood and respects the men cutting it. You tell us what you can afford to pay right now, and we'll make it work until things pick up. We're with you." A massive lump formed in my throat, choking off my words. I had lost my blood family, the people who were supposed to protect me. But standing right here in front of me in a freezing garage was a true brotherhood forged in sawdust, sweat, and hard work. "Grab your leather aprons from the truck," I told them, cracking my very first genuine, wide smile in many long months. "We've got a hell of a lot of work to do." With David and Joseph officially by my side, I wasn't just a desperate, lone guy in a garage anymore. The absolute core of Callahan and Sons, the real talent, the heartbeat of the production floor, had defected to my side. We were a highly skilled, incredibly angry army, and we were finally ready to march. While I was grinding out brutal 14-hour days with my loyal crew, slowly but surely building a pristine, untouchable reputation in the county, Elijah was living in an utterly psychotic alternate reality. I made it a strict point not to look at his social media feeds, knowing it would only enrage me, but in a small town you simply can't avoid the loud, obnoxious noise. One evening, after a long shift, Chloe walked into the kitchen and handed me her phone, her face pale. "You need to sit down and see this," she said, her voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered disgust. It was a highly produced, slick Instagram video. Elijah was standing in front of the main Callahan and Sons building, wearing expensive designer sunglasses and a tight, branded polo shirt that showed off his gym muscles. But it wasn't the shirt that caught my attention. Behind him, gleaming under the Arizona sun, sat a brand new, metallic gray, fully loaded Porsche 911 Carrera. He was leaning casually against the hood of the six-figure sports car, talking directly to the camera with a smug, arrogant grin about the massive rewards of the daily grind and taking the legendary family legacy to the absolute next level. He literally slapped the hood of the luxury car, promising big, disruptive things for the future of custom cabinetry. while promoting a discount code for cheap prefab kitchen islands. I stared at the glowing screen, utterly and completely bewildered. My brain short-circuited. I knew exactly what the profit margins of that shop were down to the penny. Even if the business was thriving, which Wyatt, the accountant, had definitively assured me it was not, buying a brand new Porsche on company credit was absolute financial suicide. It was a pathetic, wildly desperate attempt to project massive success and wealth while his actual business was violently hemorrhaging major clients and losing its best, most critical workers. He was slapping a shiny $100,000 bandage on a gaping, fatal chest wound. 20 minutes later, my personal cell phone buzzed on the counter. The caller ID made my stomach drop. It was my mother. I stared at it, hesitating for a long moment, then angrily swiped to answer. "Mason," she said. Her voice was trembling, laced with an artificial, sickly sweetness that made my skin crawl. "How are you doing, honey? We miss you so much." "I'm incredibly busy, Mom. I have a business to run." "What exactly do you want?" I wasn't playing the passive-aggressive family game anymore. She sniffled loudly into the receiver. "Your brother is under a lot of terrible stress right now. The business, well, it's just growing so incredibly fast, and he has so much on his plate with all the new, complicated marketing initiatives. It's overwhelming for him. He desperately needs help, Mason. He needs his big brother to come back home and run the production floor so he can focus on the big picture. He's spoken to your father, and they are willing to offer you your old salary back to return." I actually laughed out loud. A harsh, barking laugh that echoed in my small kitchen. The sheer, staggering audacity of the request was mind-blowing. "My old salary? You want me to come back and save him from his own catastrophic incompetence while he drives around town in a brand new Porsche he clearly can't afford? Mason, please, be reasonable," she cried, dropping the sweet act, her voice turning shrill and demanding. "He's family. He's your flesh and blood. You are actively tearing this family apart with your petty, childish stubbornness. Your father is sick over this." "No, Mom," I said, my voice dropping an octave, turning to absolute, unforgiving ice. "Dad tore this family apart at the wedding reception when he handed my life to a fraud. Elijah is tearing it apart right now with his massive, fragile ego and his sports cars. You all made your incredibly comfortable bed. Now you can lie in it and watch it burn." I hung up the phone, went into my settings, and permanently blocked her number. I was completely done being the disposable safety net for a family that had so casually thrown me into the fire. The dust from the Ridgeview estate job hadn't even settled when my phone rang again. It was a Thursday morning, crisp and cold. I was back in my freezing garage, sweeping up sawdust, feeling a strange mixture of extreme exhaustion and pure, unadulterated triumph. The massive check from Mr. Carter was sitting on my workbench, folded neatly inside an envelope. It was enough money to put a down payment on a real commercial workspace and buy 2 heavy-duty table saws outright. I wiped my hands on my jeans and pulled my phone from my pocket. It was Carter's office. His executive assistant told me that Mr. Carter requested my presence at his downtown corporate headquarters immediately. I didn't ask questions. I washed my hands with gritty pumice soap, put on a clean flannel shirt, and drove downtown. Carter's office building was a towering monument of glass and steel. It was a place where multimillion-dollar deals were struck over black coffee and firm handshakes. I walked into his sprawling corner suite on the 20th floor. Carter was standing by a massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city skyline. He turned around as soon as his heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. He didn't offer me a drink. He walked straight to his massive mahogany desk and picked up a thick, bound legal document. "Sit down, Mason," he instructed, gesturing to a leather chair. I sat. Carter threw the thick stack of papers onto the desk in front of me. The thud was loud in the quiet room. "Do you know what that is?" he asked, crossing his arms. I leaned forward and looked at the cover sheet. It was a commercial development contract. "It looks like a master vendor agreement," I said cautiously. "That," Carter said, his voice hard and precise. is the master contract for the entire Oakwood Valley luxury subdivision. We are breaking ground on 32 high-end custom homes next month. Every single house requires custom kitchen cabinetry, bathroom vanities, built-in library shelving, and crown molding. The total budget for the millwork alone is $400,000. I swallowed hard. That wasn't just a job. That was a company-making contract. That was the kind of money that changed a man's life overnight. That's a massive project, Mr. Carter. It is, he agreed, sitting down across from me. And for the last 6 months, your idiot brother Elijah has been begging me for it. He took me out to expensive steak dinners. He brought his awful wife, Olivia, who spent the entire time talking about her country club. He showed me glossy brochures and promised me the moon. He told me Callahan & Sons was expanding, upgrading, and ready to handle my entire portfolio. Carter leaned in closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine. But I am not a stupid man, Mason. I have been in the construction business for 40 years. I know a fraud when I see one. I knew the second your father handed that company to a guy who wears loafers to a job site, the quality was going to absolutely tank. I knew Elijah was nothing but a hollow suit. I was stunned. If you knew that, why did you give him the Ridgeview master bathroom job in the first place? A cold, calculated smile spread across Carter's face. It was the smile of an apex predator. Because I needed a legally binding reason to permanently blackball Callahan & Sons from every single one of my future developments. I gave him a high-profile, incredibly difficult test project. I gave him enough rope to hang himself. And he did exactly what I expected. He failed miserably. He breached the quality clauses in my standard vendor agreement. By failing that test, he legally invalidated any claim his company had to bid on the Oakwood Valley project. I completely severed his ties to my firm, and my lawyers made sure he can't sue me for lost revenue. Carter tapped the thick contract sitting between us. I didn't want Callahan & Sons. I wanted you. I just had to wait for you to officially leave and set up your own shop. So here is the deal, Mason. I want your hands on my houses. I want David and Joseph running the installations. I want the exact same obsessive, perfect quality you delivered for the last 8 years. If you can guarantee me that this $400,000 contract is yours, right here, right now. My hands were actually shaking. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cheap plastic pen, and clicked it. I didn't need to read the fine print. I knew Carter was tough but fair. I flipped to the signature page and signed my name on the dotted line. It wasn't just a signature. It was a declaration of absolute independence. You won't regret this, Mr. Carter, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He stood up and offered his hand. I shook it firmly. I know I won't, Mason. Now go lease a real shop and hire some more men. You start in 3 weeks. I walked out of that glass tower feeling 10 feet tall. I had just stolen the crown jewel of the local construction market right out from under my brother's nose. Elijah had tried to starve me out by bribing my suppliers, but raw talent and a pristine reputation had just handed me an absolute fortune. The absolute collapse of Callahan & Sons happened much faster than anyone could have ever predicted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just 4 days after I signed the massive Oakwood Valley contract. I was busy looking at commercial real estate listings, trying to find a proper warehouse to lease, when my phone rang. It was Wyatt, the accountant. I picked up the phone. Hey, Wyatt, what's going on? It's over, Mason, Wyatt said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It sounded flat, hollow, and utterly exhausted. The castle has completely crumbled. I stopped what I was doing. What happened? Give it to me straight. Wyatt took a deep, shaky breath. The bank froze the main operating accounts at 9 o'clock this morning. Elijah missed 3 consecutive payments on that massive, high-interest commercial loan he took out to cover the marketing budget and his ridiculous car lease. The creditors finally pulled the plug. They literally locked the accounts. We can't cut payroll. We can't buy a single box of screws. We are completely dead in the water. Where is Elijah? I asked, a cold sense of dread creeping up my spine despite everything. He's hiding inside his glass office with the blinds pulled down. Wyatt scoffed bitterly. He won't answer his phone. Julian from the lumber yard showed up an hour ago screaming his head off because his massive invoice bounced. Elijah refused to come out. Julian threatened to call the police and file fraud charges. It was a total circus. And what about Olivia? I asked. I knew exactly how his gold-digging wife would react to the money drying up. Oh, it gets better. Wyatt let out a harsh, dry laugh. Olivia showed up 30 minutes after the bank called. She stormed into his office. They had a screaming match so loud the guys on the floor could hear every single word over the sound of the air compressors. She called him a pathetic loser. She said she wasn't going to stick around to be married to a bankrupt laughingstock. She threw her wedding ring right at his face, packed her expensive bags, and drove off. She filed for divorce by noon. She's completely gone, Mason. She took whatever cash was left in their joint personal account and vanished. I stood there in the middle of my dusty garage, completely speechless. The glorious, shiny empire my father had so proudly handed to his golden child had burned to the ground in less than a single calendar year. Elijah had lost the business, his reputation, and his wife all in the span of a few terrible hours. "What are you doing, Wyatt?" I finally asked. "I'm packing my desk," he replied tiredly. "I haven't been paid in 3 weeks anyway. But before I leave this sinking ship, I'm doing one last thing." Elijah ordered me to hide the ledgers. He explicitly told me to cook the books so your parents wouldn't find out how bad the debt really was. I'm not going down for corporate fraud to protect that arrogant idiot. "So what did you do?" "I bypassed him entirely," Wyatt said, a hint of fierce satisfaction returning to his tired voice. "I printed out the raw, unedited, bleeding ledgers. Every single missed payment, every bounced check, every defaulted vendor contract. I put it all in a thick manila envelope and paid a private courier to hand-deliver it directly to your father's front door. Matthew is going to see exactly what his golden boy did to his legacy. Good luck, Mason. You were the only good thing about this place." The line went dead. I stared at the phone. The reckoning had finally arrived. That evening, I was sitting at my small kitchen table with Chloe, eating takeout and going over the preliminary blueprints for the Oakwood Valley houses. My phone was resting on the counter. At exactly 7:15, the screen lit up. The caller ID boldly displayed the name Matthew Callahan. My father. I stopped chewing. Chloe looked at the phone, then looked at me. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly heavy. My father hadn't called me since the day of the wedding, almost a full year ago. He had let my mother do all the dirty work, all the begging and pleading for me to return. Now, facing the absolute destruction of his namesake company, he was finally picking up the phone himself. I didn't reach for it. I just sat there, my hands folded on the table, and watched the phone vibrate across the cheap laminate counter. It rang 5 times, then clicked over to voicemail. A notification popped up on the screen. He had left an audio message. "Are you going to listen to it?" Chloe asked softly, placing her hand gently over mine. "Not tonight," I said, picking up a pen and turning my attention back to the blueprints. "Tonight, I am working on my own future. His past can wait until tomorrow." The next morning, I woke up early. The sun wasn't even up yet. I brewed a strong cup of black coffee, poured it into a travel mug, and walked out to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat. The cab was freezing cold. I didn't turn the engine on. I pulled my phone out of my heavy jacket pocket, tapped the voicemail icon, and pressed play. The message was exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. For the first 3 entire minutes, there were absolutely no words. Just the heavy, ragged, agonizing sound of my father sobbing. He was weeping with a profound, terrifying intensity. I had never, in 34 years of life, heard my father cry. He was a stoic, emotionally repressed man who believed showing sadness was a sign of unforgivable weakness. But sitting alone in my freezing truck, I listened to a grown man completely fall apart. The sound was raw, ugly, and filled with a crushing, suffocating guilt. He was gasping for air, choking on his own tears, trying desperately to form words that his throat simply refused to release. I sat there perfectly still. My coffee went cold in my hands. I didn't feel a sudden rush of sympathy. I didn't feel the urge to drive over and hug him. I just felt a profound, heavy emptiness. Finally, around the 3-minute mark, his voice broke through the static. It was raspy, broken, and incredibly small. "Mason," he choked out, coughing violently. "Mason, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry, my son. I did you wrong. I did you so wrong." He paused, crying heavily into the receiver again. "I knew it when I did it," he confessed, the words pouring out in a panicked rush. "I knew it was wrong when I stood up at that wedding. And I did it anyway because it was easier. It was just easier. It was easier to give the company to Elijah because he was weak and he needed it, and you were so incredibly strong. You were the one who earned it. You built that entire business with your bare hands, your time, and your good heart. And I took it. I just took it and I gave it away like it was mine to give. It wasn't mine, Mason. It was yours." Another long, agonizing pause filled with ragged breathing. "Wyatt sent the books. I saw them last night. It's all gone, Mason. Everything I worked for, everything you built. Elijah destroyed it all. He threw it away. And all I can think about right now is the look on your face on that patio at the wedding. You didn't even argue with me. You just left. And that is what absolutely kills me. You didn't argue because you already knew my soul was entirely compromised. You loved me enough not to make a scene, and I repaid you with treason. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve to call you my son. But I need you to know that I finally see what I did. I love you, Mason. I always have. I was just too stupid, too blind, and too cowardly to protect you." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I sat in my truck for a very long time. I hit replay. I listened to it again. I listened to my father's pride completely shatter into a million jagged pieces. I listened to the voicemail 3 times in a row. Some people might hear that kind of raw apology and immediately rush to forgive and forget. But forgiveness is not a simple light switch you can just flip on demand. You don't just erase 8 years of brutal exploitation and public humiliation because the perpetrator finally feels guilty after the consequences arrive. I placed the phone on the passenger seat, turned the key in the ignition, and drove to work. The apology was real, but the damage was permanent. 2 days after the voicemail, I decided it was time to end the saga completely. I couldn't just ignore them forever. There needed to be a final, definitive conclusion to the nightmare. Before I made my move, I called Luke, my lawyer. I asked him to run a quiet, thorough public records search on my parents' property and Elijah's recent financial filings. I needed to know exactly how deep the hole was. Luke called me back 4 hours later. The information he gave me turned my blood entirely to ice. It was worse than Wyatt or my dad even realized. Armed with a thick manila folder of legal documents, I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. The sky was overcast and deeply gray. I pulled into the familiar driveway. The grass was overgrown. The front porch light was burnt out. The house looked tired and defeated. I didn't bother knocking. I pushed the front door open and walked into the living room. The scene was incredibly grim. My mother, Margaret, was sitting on the floral sofa, her face buried in a handful of crumpled tissues, weeping loudly. My father, Matthew, was pacing the worn carpet like a trapped animal. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a single week. His skin was gray, his shoulders were heavily slumped, and his eyes were bloodshot and frantic. Sitting in an armchair in the corner, looking completely detached from reality, was Elijah. He was wearing sweatpants and a dirty t-shirt, staring blankly at the muted television screen. The golden child looked like a beaten, pathetic dog. My dad stopped pacing the second he saw me. He froze. "Mason," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You came." My mother looked up, her eyes wide with desperate, manic hope. "Oh, Mason, thank God. Thank God you're here. We are in so much terrible trouble. Please tell us you can help. We know you got that massive new contract with Carter. We heard the rumors. You have to save the company. You have to save your brother. Please, Mason. I looked at her with absolute disgust. Even now, standing in the smoking ruins of their terrible decisions, her first instinct was to demand that I sacrifice my own hard-earned success to rescue the son who stole from me. I am not here to save the company. Mom, I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. Callahan and Sons is entirely dead. It is a rotting corpse. Elijah killed it. Elijah finally looked away from the television. He glared at me, a flash of his old, arrogant entitlement flaring up. Shut up, Mason. You don't know anything about running a modern corporate business. I just hit a bad cash flow cycle. If you just loan me 50 grand to cover payroll, I can turn it all around. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked over to the heavy oak coffee table and violently slammed the thick manila folder down on the wood. The loud smack made everyone in the room jump. A bad cash flow cycle? I repeated, staring a hole straight through my brother. Is that what you call corporate fraud? My dad stepped forward, his hands shaking. Mason, what is that? What are those papers? That, I said, pointing at the folder, is the absolute truth. You read Wyatt's ledgers, Dad. You saw the missed payments and the vendor debt. But Wyatt only saw the company accounts. He didn't see the personal side. I had my lawyer dig into the public county records this morning. I opened the folder and pulled out a certified copy of a bank document. I held it up so my father could see it clearly. You asked me to come back and save this family, I said, looking directly at my dad. But you don't even know the extent of the betrayal. Do you know how Elijah paid for that brand new $100,000 Porsche sitting in his driveway right now? He leased it through the business, my dad stammered, his eyes darting nervously. He told me it was a corporate marketing expense. He lied to you, I said coldly. He couldn't lease it through the business because the business credit was already completely maxed out and in the gutter. He couldn't get a standard auto loan because his personal credit is absolute garbage. I threw the document onto the coffee table. He forged your signature, Dad. He manipulated the power of attorney documents you foolishly gave him during the business transfer. He went to a predatory lending bank and secretly took out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on this very house. Your house. The house you worked 30 years to pay off. He used the equity in your home as direct collateral to secure the loan for his sports car and to cover his massive personal credit card debts. The silence in the living room was absolute and terrifying. It felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. My mother let out a horrific, piercing gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Her eyes widened in pure horror as she looked at Elijah. My dad slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the document. He put on his reading glasses. He read the bank letterhead. He saw his forged signature. He saw the massive dollar amount of the lien placed against his property. His knees literally buckled. He collapsed onto the sofa next to my mother, the paper slipping from his fingers. He started hyperventilating, grabbing his chest. Elijah. My dad wheezed, looking at his youngest son with an expression of complete and utter devastation. Tell me this is a lie. Tell me you didn't put a mortgage on our home. Tell me you didn't risk your mother's roof over a damn car. Elijah shrank back into the armchair, refusing to make eye contact. His arrogant facade finally, permanently shattered. He looked down at the floor, his face pale and sweating. I was going to pay it back, he mumbled weakly. I just needed some temporary capital to project success. You have to spend money to make money. It was just an investment in my personal brand. I was going to pay the bank back as soon as the big contracts came in. There are no big contracts. My dad suddenly screamed, his voice tearing through the house with a terrifying fury I had never witnessed before. He shot up from the couch, his face purple with absolute rage. You bankrupted my company. You drove away my best son. Your wife left you. And now you have stolen my house. You thieving, worthless parasite. My mother threw herself over my dad, sobbing hysterically, trying to pull him back down to the couch before he had a heart attack. Matthew, please calm down. We can fix this. Mason will fix this. Mason has the money now. She looked at me, her face streaked with black mascara, her eyes pleading with a desperate, pathetic intensity. Mason, you have to pay the mortgage off. You have to save the house. You're making so much money now. Please, do it for your father. I stood tall, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my family. I felt nothing but a cold, hard sense of absolute justice. They had finally reaped exactly what they had sown. I am not paying a single dime of Elijah's debt, I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet, tragic room. You chose him. You handed him the keys to the kingdom without a second thought. You actively conspired behind my back to steal 8 years of my life to give him a free ride. Now, the ride is over, and the brutal bill has finally come due. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment 1 below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The chaotic screaming in the living room eventually died down, replaced by the heavy, suffocating sound of my parents' quiet, desperate sobbing. Elijah remained glued to his chair, staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his own massive failures. He had finally run out of excuses, out of charm, and out of other people's money to spend. My father looked up at me from the sofa. His face was entirely devoid of hope. The proud, stubborn patriarch who had confidently handed over $1 million company at a wedding reception was completely gone. In his place sat a broken, terrified old man who was staring down the barrel of homelessness in his retirement years. What do we do, Mason? He asked, his voice barely a raspy whisper. The bank is going to foreclose on the house. We have absolutely nothing left. My savings are gone. The company accounts are frozen solid. We are going to be living on the street. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, white business card. I walked over and placed it gently on the coffee table, right next to the forged mortgage documents. It was Luke's card. You call this number tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I instructed calmly, stepping back to maintain my physical distance. Luke is a ruthless, highly effective corporate bankruptcy attorney. He is not cheap, but he is the best in the state. I have already spoken to him about your situation. My mother looked up, a tiny, pathetic glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. He's going to save the company? No, I quickly corrected her, crushing that false hope instantly. Callahan & Sons is entirely dead. The brand is toxic. The debt is insurmountable. Luke is going to help you legally file for Chapter 7 total corporate bankruptcy and liquidate every single asset the company owns. The building, the trucks, the remaining machinery. All of it gets sold to the highest bidder to satisfy the angry creditors. I turned my attention squarely to my father. Luke's primary job is to aggressively protect your personal assets from the fallout of Elijah's corporate fraud. He is going to initiate immediate legal action against Elijah for the unauthorized forgery on the mortgage documents. By proving Elijah committed direct financial fraud without your consent, Luke can likely force the predatory bank to uncouple the lien from this house. You will lose the entire business, Dad. Every last splinter of it. But if you do exactly what Luke says, and if you throw Elijah completely under the legal bus where he belongs, you will get to keep the roof over your head. Elijah's head snapped up, his eyes wide with absolute panic. You're telling them to sue me? You're telling our own parents to press fraud charges against me? I looked at him with zero sympathy. You committed a felony, Elijah. You stole their home. You aren't the golden child anymore. You are a massive liability, and it is time you face the actual, legal consequences of your reckless actions. I looked back at my parents one last time. They looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly defeated. I am paying Luke's initial retainer fee, I told them. Consider it my final contribution to this family. But after today, I am completely done. Do not call my phone asking for cash. Do not show up at my shop asking for favors. I am drawing a permanent, hard line right here, right now in this room. You made your terrible choices. Now you have to live with them. I turned around and walked toward the front door. My mother called out my name, begging me to stay, begging me to sit down and eat dinner with them. I didn't stop. I opened the door, stepped out into the cool, gray afternoon air, and walked to my truck. I drove away from that house feeling a massive, crushing weight lift off my shoulders. I had finally severed the toxic, parasitic chains of my family's expectations. I was completely free. Time is a relentless, incredibly effective healer, but massive success is an even better cure. 1 full year after that brutal confrontation in my parents' living room, my entire life was completely unrecognizable. The $400,000 contract for the Oakwood Valley subdivision was merely the spark that ignited a massive powder keg of success. I delivered those 32 houses 2 weeks ahead of schedule, under budget, and with a level of flawless craftsmanship that left Mr. Carter absolutely speechless. Word spread like wildfire through the wealthy enclaves of the state. Prominent architects and high-end interior designers began actively refusing to work with anyone else but me. They knew that if my name was attached to the millwork, the project would be absolute perfection. My freezing, drafty little garage was a thing of the distant past. I used the massive profits from the Carter job to lease a sprawling, 10,000-square-foot commercial warehouse on the prime side of town. The new shop was a beautiful, echoing cathedral of industry. I invested heavily in state-of-the-art CNC routers, massive dust collection systems, and premium spray booths. I didn't just rehire David and Joseph. I made them my highly paid floor foremen. We hired 8 more incredibly talented craftsmen to keep up with the overwhelming demand. We were running 2 shifts just to clear the massive backlog of orders. I didn't name the new company after myself. I refused to let ego dictate my brand. I called it Apex Custom Woodworks. We were at the absolute top of the food chain, and everyone in the county knew it. But the success wasn't just confined to the business ledger. On a sunny Saturday afternoon in October, Chloe and I stood in the driveway of our beautiful, sprawling new home. It sat on 2 acres of quiet, wooded land just outside the city limits. It had a massive wraparound porch, a huge gourmet kitchen that I had completely gutted and rebuilt myself with solid cherry cabinets, and a massive backyard. Chloe was kneeling in the dirt, wearing gardening gloves, actively planting a row of bright yellow sunflowers along the fence line. She wiped a smudge of dirt from her forehead and smiled up at me. "It's perfect, Mason," she said, looking around the property. "It's really ours." I pulled her up from the dirt and wrapped my arms tightly around her waist. She had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. She had held my hand in that freezing apartment when I thought my life was completely over. She was the steady, unwavering rock I built my actual foundation upon. "Yeah," I smiled, kissing the top of her head. "It's all ours. Nobody can ever take this away." I had finally achieved exactly what I had always wanted. I had built a lasting, unshakable legacy. But this time I owned every single brick, every single nail, and every single ounce of the equity. I was the master of my own destiny, and it felt absolutely incredible. While my life was rapidly ascending to new, incredible heights, the brutal, unrelenting consequences of karma were aggressively catching up with the people who had tried to bury me. The legal fallout from Elijah's massive financial fraud was completely spectacular. Luke, my brilliant lawyer, had absolutely eviscerated him in court. To save their own home from foreclosure, my parents were forced to officially testify against Elijah, confirming the gross forgery of the mortgage documents. Elijah narrowly avoided actual prison time by agreeing to a highly restrictive, incredibly punitive plea deal, but his life was entirely ruined. The bank immediately repossessed his beloved, shiny Porsche straight out of the driveway. His credit score dropped to a level where he couldn't even rent a cheap apartment without a massive cash deposit. Olivia's high-priced divorce lawyers took whatever microscopic assets he had left, leaving him completely destitute. The golden child, the brilliant corporate visionary, was currently working 60 hours a week at a miserable, low-level call center, aggressively cold-calling angry seniors to sell them terrible auto insurance policies just to make his court-ordered restitution payments. I saw him once, entirely by accident, at a cheap gas station on the edge of town. He was wearing a faded, wrinkled polo shirt and driving a beat-up, rusted sedan with a cracked windshield. He looked exhausted, defeated, and completely miserable. We locked eyes across the gas pumps for a brief second. He quickly looked away, his face turning bright red with intense shame, and hurried into his terrible car. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. I just kept pumping my premium gas and drove away. Elijah wasn't the only casualty of the Callahan and Sons collapse. Julian, the arrogant owner of the massive lumber yard who had so coldly cut me off to secure Elijah's exclusive contract, also learned a very painful lesson in loyalty. When Elijah's company went violently bankrupt, they defaulted on hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid material invoices owed directly to Julian. The massive financial hit crippled the lumber yard's cash flow. Julian was forced to violently downsize, fire half his staff, and eventually sell his entire failing business to a massive corporate conglomerate for pennies on the dollar to avoid his own personal bankruptcy. He backed the wrong horse, and it dragged him completely under. As for my parents, the absolute loss of their life's work deeply, permanently humbled them. The massive Callahan and Sons building was sold off at a public auction to a discount carpet liquidator. They managed to keep their house thanks to Luke's aggressive legal maneuvering, but they were forced to live entirely on their meager Social Security checks. My mother completely stopped bragging to her friends. My father spent his days quietly tending to his small vegetable garden, a broken man who realized far too late the true cost of his blinding favoritism. We maintained a very cold, distant, strictly superficial relationship. I would send them a generic card on major holidays, and occasionally I would pick up the phone if my mother called, but the conversations were brief, hollow, and strictly limited to the weather. They knew the permanent boundaries I had set, and they never, ever dared to cross them again. They had lost their son, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. It was late on a Friday night. The massive Apex Custom Woodworks shop was completely quiet. The massive crew had clocked out hours ago, heading home to their families for the weekend. The heavy bay doors were pulled down, and the only light came from the small, glowing desk lamp in my glass-walled supervisor office. I walked out onto the expansive, spotless production floor. The air was thick with the familiar, incredibly comforting smell of fresh-cut cedar, sweet lacquer, and raw potential. I ran my hand along the smooth, cold cast-iron edge of one of the massive new table saws. I thought back to that terrible night at the Sedona wedding reception. I remembered the exact, suffocating feeling of the air leaving my lungs when my father handed the leather folder to Elijah. I remembered the intense, burning humiliation, the profound betrayal, and the terrifying, lonely drive home in the dark. For a very long time, I carried that anger like a heavy, jagged rock in my chest. I thought losing Callahan and Sons was the greatest, most unfair tragedy of my entire life. I thought I had been viciously robbed of my rightful inheritance. But standing here now, surrounded by the massive, humming empire I had built entirely on my own, I finally realized the absolute truth. My father denying me that company wasn't a tragedy. It was the greatest, most important gift he could have ever possibly given me. If he had done the right thing, if he had handed me the keys to the shop that night, I would still be trapped in that small, dusty cinderblock building. I would still be dealing with his outdated, terrible business practices. I would still be carrying the heavy, exhausting weight of his expectations, constantly trying to prove myself worthy of a name I didn't choose. I would have spent my entire adult life quietly building someone else's legacy. Instead, the betrayal forced me into the freezing cold. It forced me to strip away all the safety nets and discover exactly what I was truly made of. It forced me to rely entirely on my own two hands, my own relentless work ethic, and my own unshakable integrity. I didn't just rebuild what I lost. I built something infinitely better, stronger, and more resilient. I built a company that reflects exactly who I am. I looked up at the massive, illuminated sign hanging proudly above the main office door. Apex Custom Woodworks. It didn't have my father's name on it. It didn't have my grandfather's name on it. It didn't need to. It was mine. I turned off the main breaker switch, plunging the massive shop into quiet darkness, locked the heavy steel doors, and drove home to my beautiful wife. The past was permanently buried in sawdust, and the future was absolutely wide open. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It was a long, painful journey, but reliving it reminds me of how far I've truly come. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever felt undervalued or overlooked by the people who were supposed to support you the most. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, where you had to walk away from everything to finally build your own worth? I'd love to hear your experiences down in the comments. And if you made it all the way to this exact moment, you are officially part of the 1% club. Drop a W in the comments below. W stands for winner. It lets me know who the truly amazing people are who stick around until the very end. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and follow the channel so we can share more incredible journeys together. See you in the next